Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for Issues and Answers, the New Mexico Economic Forum. Coming up, we'll take you to Truth or Consequences to hear what residents there think the state should be doing to boost our economy with a jobless rate of about 6%, 2 points higher than the national average. The recovery is still a struggle in New Mexico. To bring us up to date from New Mexico State University, economist Dr. Jim Peach and Dr. Chris Erickson. Chris will tackle the New Mexico picture coming up, but first, Jim looks at the national and international scene. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. It's always good to be here. We always enjoy this. It really is a nice thing that you all do.
We do too.
Let's start with the international economy, because we live in an international economy and it directly affects the national economy and then New Mexico. Last year, the world economy, GDP, was $78.9 trillion. And of that, the U.S. produced about $19 trillion. All of the forecasts from the usual suspects are that the global economy is doing very well. We'll grow about 3.7% in 2017. The final numbers aren't in yet, and a little bit higher than that in 2018. The one kind of glitch in the system there is that the volume of international trade fell considerably in 2015 and 2016, from about 19.5 trillion in 2014 to only 16 trillion last year. And that was not really because we traded less, but because of the price of commodities fell, especially oil. And so the dollar value of that trade fell quite a bit, and that's important to us later on, as is NAFTA and some other things. The U.S. economy is doing moderately well. The GDP numbers were released this week. The second estimate of GDP for the fourth quarter of 17 came in at 2.5% and 2.3% for the year, which is just about average during the recovery. There's been no change in that figure. And most economists are predicting somewhere about 2.7 or 2.8 for 2018. If you listen to the press, you will hear some wild estimates of 4%, and I heard one that was even higher, but those are from people who were promoting the recent tax cut act, and there's no sign that that's going to occur. Not the tax cut, that did occur, but that the growth rate of the economy will accelerate anywhere. The Fed still has it at a 2.4, 2.5% for 2018, and most economists are in that range of 2.5 to 2.8 or 2.9. Not much different than we've been doing. We've had a pretty good record of employment growth since October of 2010. We've had 88 straight months of employment growth. Last year, we averaged about 181,000 new jobs per month. That's a little bit lower than the average over the recovery, which is about 196,000. The unemployment rate in January stayed at 4.1% as it had been in December. Not much difference there, and many economists are talking about whether or not we've reached full employment. I think not. We're nowhere close. The remarkable thing about the U.S. economy right now is happening not far from us, and that is oil production. In November of last year, in 2017, we were just shy of 10.4 million barrels a day. And The reason that's important is that was our previous peak in 1970. And the estimate for January is 10.3 million barrels a day, and the Energy Information Administration suggests we'll average 10.6 this year and 11.2 in 2019, both of which would be all-time highs. And a lot of that is because of what's going on in the Permian Basin. And my colleague, Dr. Erickson, can talk about that some. So where is the economy? Not bad. We're kind of cruising along. There are some threats out there, including the renegotiation of NAFTA or the abandonment of NAFTA. That could throw a real monkey wrench into things, as could events always internationally. But the reasonable expectation is we'll do about the same this year as we did last year. There's nothing on the horizon that suggests much different. The new budget by the administration has been announced. They've cut a lot of programs, but the overall size of the budget is not smaller than it used to be. The Tax Cut Act, it is still too soon to evaluate what kind of an effect that will have. It really is an unknown out there. If consumers get a little bit more income, they can do a lot of things with it. They can spend it, which would stimulate the economy, or they could save it or pay off old debt, which does nothing to stimulate the economy. So what I expect and what most people expect is about the same as last year, nothing dramatic, and that's probably good news. I've been on this show when we had nothing but bad news to bring you.
I remember. Well, speaking of bad news, Chris, I know that while, as Jim said, that you know, on the U.S. side, we look at it, unemployment about 4%. We're closer to 6% in New Mexico.
Right.
So a third higher and one of the highest rates in the country.
Right.
I think only Alaska was doing worse, the last
right.
reading. And we've got challenges. We really do, don't we?
And so we tied with Washington, D.C. for the second lowest unemployment rate in the country. And Washington, D.C. has the Lincoln Monument to make up for that for that high unemployment. We don't have that. I guess we have the beauty of the desert, though. So last year was a better year than we've had for a while. We were also doing better than we were doing 2 years ago, and we're doing better than we were doing 3 years ago. And the good news, as Jim mentioned, is oil prices. So I looked this morning on, just actually about half an hour before I came over, price of oil is $61.68. That is compared to $54 a year ago. That's compared to $30 2 years ago, so it's doubled in about 2 years. But it's still less than what it was just prior to the financial crisis in 2008. In 2008, in June of 2008, it peaked at $140 a barrel. And of course, that's a big deal because in New Mexico, about a third of our budget our state budget, comes from oil and gas revenues. And so that is what's been dragging down the state economy, the state budget, I should say, is the low oil and gas prices. And the good news right now, and it is good news, is that prices are up and that production in the state is up. Jim mentioned that the national economy just barely missed setting an oil production record. New Mexico is producing at record levels of oil, and that, as Jim mentioned, is coming mainly from Permian Basin, is driven by technology, by fracking, and that's very good news for the state. However, if you take everything in total, the recovery in the state is weak compared to the national economy. Our employment growth over the last 12 months was 1.3%, but if you compare it to December 2007, which was the peak prior to the Great Recession. Great Recession has been dated to have started in December 2007. We're still down 0.3% in employment over that decade-long period. and that's not good, because the national level, at the national economy has more than recovered, and we're not doing it. And what's driving that lack of recovery? One thing is the fact that oil prices are down compared to what they had been. Another thing is that the increased productivity in the oil patch means that we don't need quite as much employment per gallon or per barrel of production. Another reason, and this is very important, is that our state depends more on federal employment than does most states, and federal employment and government employment in general is down in the state, and that's driven by budgetary issues going on at the federal level and to some extent at the state level. We're not doing as well as our neighbors. For example, Colorado saw employment growth of 13.7% since the beginning of the Great Recession. Las Cruces is doing better than the state as a whole if you look at it in the long run. Looking back to the beginning of the Great Recession in 2007, we're up 3.4%, which isn't bad. That's the best performance in the state among the metropolitan areas in the state. But if you look over the last year, we're down 1.1%. So we are as a city, we are in recession right now. The state is doing better, but we are not. Also, we can see the problems with the state in the growth rate of the population. Since 1960, in every decade, New Mexico has outgrown the nation in terms of population growth, except for the 2010s. And in the 2010s, we are lagging behind the national economy and population growth. Of course, Jim is an expert on demography of New Mexico and demography in general. He teaches a demography class here at NMSU, and he might add something to what I said when we get to the Q&A. But I think that it's very hard to say it's good news that we have this lag in population growth compared to the national economy.
And that's a huge problem, of course, as you know, not only for the state overall, but it has an outsized effect in certain areas, such as where we're sitting right now, New Mexico State University, because we have a reduction in young people, 15 to 19, so there's a smaller pool from which to draw for in-state students.
That's exactly right. So, and of course, New Mexico State University is the second largest employer in the area. And by the way, when I say second largest in the area, I'm treating White Sands as a single employer, even though we know that there are contractors out there, and that's not really legally a single employer. But it's the second largest source of jobs in the city, and we are lagging in terms of growth at even compared to the state as a whole. NMSU is lagging in terms of its growth. In fact, one report I heard recently is that we've lost about 800 jobs on campus over the last couple of years, and that's not good news for Las Cruces. And of course, you can't talk about Las Cruces without talking about poverty. We have a very high poverty rate. Our childhood poverty rate is around 40%. And Kids Count, which is a group that keeps track of these sort of things, lists New Mexico as one of the worst performing states in the country based on how our kids are doing. And a lot of that's driven by child poverty, and then a lot of it's also driven by graduation rates from high school, which are very low in the state. You know, and the question you might ask is, why are we lagging behind? I think it's important to not give too much, blame the governor too much for things like this, and blame state government for too much like this. A lot of this stuff is out of the control of the governor and the legislature. But I do think it tells you pretty starkly that policies that are aimed at lowering taxes, that are aimed at cutting government spending in a way that it doesn't take into account the losses in terms of benefits from those government programs. I'm thinking mainly here about K-12 spending and teacher salaries. And of course, teacher salaries have a huge impact on retention of teachers in the school district, retention of good teachers, the teachers who have other alternatives. I'm also thinking of road construction and things like that. These are things that benefit and contribute to the economic development of the state. And by cutting taxes, particularly business taxes, corporate taxes, but also taxes, income taxes, that has not been a policy that has attracted business into the state. And to some extent, it's been counterproductive in that it's led to a loss of funding of needed programs.
Okay, we will have questions for you, Chris and Jim, coming up from our audience. But first, KRWG is involved in the Solutions Journalism Project, and last fall we held a focus group in Truth or Consequences with our partner nmpolitics.net. Here's a small part of what folks in Tier C had to say about the New Mexico economy.
Rebecca Dow is on a mission. She says it's long past time for New Mexico to move forward.
Right now, I think we need hope. I think we need hope for a better future.
Dow was elected to the New Mexico State Legislature in 2016. The Republican represents District 38 in the State House, which includes parts of Grant, Hidalgo, and Sierra counties. Dow was part of a recent Solutions Journalism Network focus group in Truth or Consequences, the Sierra County town of about 6,000 people, known in these parts as Tier C. Dow completed her first legislative session earlier this year and says special interests have a major voice in New Mexico politics.
I think there's a lot of special interest and a lot of the people who have the largest voice or the deepest pocket or the longest relationships in our state do get heard more. I think that's what I learned as a freshman legislator, is that to be able to get to Santa Fe and advocate for your cause definitely makes a difference.
Suspicion about special treatment runs high in Tier C. Sierra County is home to one of New Mexico's biggest economic development projects. Spaceport America was launched with a public vote to approve local spaceport taxes about a decade ago. Local taxpayers have paid a portion of the $250 million cost of the facility through gross receipts taxes that were approved by voters in Sierra and Doña Ana counties. The State General Fund also provides money for its operation.
I've heard mostly that people feel like it's a boondoggle. It does seem like a boondoggle to Tier C, but I mean, we've been here for a long time and heard about the spaceport for a long time, and it's still kind of, you know, a nebulous idea, even though there's a building and a sculpture.
Jessica Murphy has lived in Tier C for 8 years. Another member of our focus group, she reflects the view of many here who are wary of Spaceport America. But government officials often tout the potential of the spaceport, including Tier C City Manager Juan Fuentes.
And we're fortunate that it is in our backyard. I think just like as any new venture, you know, it takes time to develop and grow, but not all states have a spaceport. And we know that that's a new industry that's up and coming. There's more activity going on, especially more private investment.
There couldn't be a better location than downtown Tier C for our event today. We had a chance to talk to folks about the future of the city, a future that a lot of folks are hoping will be very bright if Spaceport America takes off. But of course, there are enormous concerns about the future of the spaceport and all of New Mexico.
In recent years, New Mexico has faced one budget crisis after another. This has led to program cuts and a failure to provide regular cost of living adjustments for state employees, as well as many local government and university employees in departments that depend on state funding. In this environment of budget austerity, some find continued spending on what are described as economic development projects like Spaceport America particularly disturbing. Critics say the money would be better spent on inflationary adjustments in employee compensation and infrastructure, which provide both immediate and long-term benefits for the state and local economies. New Mexico's continued failure to increase education spending in line with inflation has resulted in a widening gulf between New Mexico teacher pay compared with other districts. For example, a starting teacher in Las Cruces Public Schools makes $34,000 a year. Just down Interstate 10 in El Paso, Texas, starting teachers make $48,300 a year in the El Paso Independent School District. Low pay and white-collar jobs contributes to a lagging economy that also means low pay for many blue-collar jobs. Jared Bartu of Bartu Sand and Gravel and Truth or Consequences also participated in our focus group.
It's tough. That's the hardest thing we face is finding good people. And when I find them, we try to keep them, you know. A lot of them leave and go out of town, make more money, you know.
U.S. Census Bureau numbers for 2016 show New Mexico's median household income was a little more than $48,000, over $10,000 less than the national median of more than $59,000. Bartu agrees education is an important priority for improving the state's economy, but he says K-12 education does not provide enough support for vocational instruction.
I learned how to weld in high school. I think they're not pushing the trades thing as much, and they're not encouraging it. You know, everyone's wanting to make $100,000 a year doing nothing, and that's not reality.
Along with investment in education, those who work in economic development say New Mexico must learn from other states that place a high priority on helping communities rather than spending on individual companies or industries. It's not a new idea. Companies are attracted to locations with a highly educated workforce, good infrastructure, and a high quality of life. Way back in 1986, the Committee for Economic Development said financial subsidies are rarely a significant concern in wise business location decisions and usually amount to little more than a government giveaway and burden on taxpayers, including corporate taxpayers forced to subsidize their competitors. To help with infrastructure, leaders in Truth or Consequences say additional funding is needed from the federal government.
I think a major piece of that is actually helping the smaller communities to improve their infrastructure and replace some of their infrastructure, because those are high-ticket items. And obviously, in order to recruit businesses, in order to recruit people to come into town to promote some of our economic activities, we need to make sure that we have the adequate infrastructure in place.
While everyone in our focus group agreed growth and new opportunities are needed in Tier C and all of New Mexico, there's also a yearning to hold on to the state's culture and way of life. Jessica Murphy has lived in Sierra County for 8 years, but she's a lifelong New Mexican, having grown up in Hagerman, a Chavez County town with a population of a little more than 1,200 in the 2010 census.
New Mexicans don't exactly always want things to change. We like things to be laid back. We value our clean environment, we value open spaces, and we value a quiet life. And so there's something to be said for that. Now, of course, when you compare that with demographics that show that poverty is kicking our butts, or that our kids don't have a good quality of life, there has to be some sort of balance there. But for certain, we do need to value what we have, because it's really important to a lot of people.
If you're just joining us, this is Issues and Answers, the New Mexico Economic Forum. From New Mexico State University, we are pleased to have with us economists Dr. Jim Peach and Dr. Chris Erickson. And now audience questions for our guest. We ask our audience members to say their first name and where they live before their question. Hi.
Yes, I'm Leo. I live here in Las Cruces. And my question is for Dr. Erickson. You mentioned the state this year is doing well because the oil and gas industry is doing well, and mentioned the tax revenue is dependent on the performance of the oil and gas industry. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on maybe some policies or options that the state could do to not be as dependent on that one industry. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, one of the things that economists often recommend is that economies, individuals, businesses, economies should do what they do best. They should play to their comparative advantage. Our comparative advantage is in providing government facilities. We have Sandia, we have Los Alamos, we have White Sands. These are all research facilities that are world class, and we do well in that. That's one of the things that we specialize with going back to World War II. And we also specialize in oil and gas, and it's very difficult to not take advantage of that natural resource, which is located in our state, of which we are seeing more and more production from that. And but but that doesn't mean we can't do some things to diversify our economy.
Let me ask you, before you move on to other things, related to oil and gas, because it's also energy, you're talking about playing to advantages. We also have a lot of wind and we have a lot of sunshine.
Absolutely.
And people say New Mexico could be a leader in renewable energy.
We are a leader in it, but the problem,
we're not doing as much as we could, though.
We could probably do more, but we are a leader in that. And but I'll point out to you that solar and wind facilities do not employ a lot of people. They are, if you go drive by a wind farm, you'll notice that you can go by them and you can see no one working. And solar is the same way. It's not that there are maintenance, there are people who do maintenance, but
and of course installation.
And of course installation.
We've seen that all around Las Cruces on tops of roofs. And the state legislature passed a solar tax credit again. They allowed it to expire.
Right.
We will find out probably next week if the governor signs that, and so that may help keep things going.
Absolutely. So. And we are getting so there are utilities, local utilities have moved away from coal towards solar and wind, towards renewable sources. My understanding, I was talking to an individual who ran the numbers. This particular person said that for him to invest in the solar panels on his home would give him a return of about 8%. I said, well, I thought that was pretty good. And he thought, no, I've got other things I can put my money in. The stock market's doing 40%, I can do that.
Okay.
I think he actually made a mistake in that case.
All right, so very quickly, what are the other key things that you think New Mexico can do to diversify its economy? I know you write a lot about education, and you already addressed that in your opening statements.
Absolutely.
We saw in the report the disparity in pay is enormous.
Yep.
So.
And K-12 education is number one, but even beyond that, we can do things to make ourselves more business friendly. We have a lot of bureaucracy and old-fashioned approaches to regulating business that add nothing to our quality of life, that add nothing to our, for example, protecting the environment, but are just not very well run. And we need to reduce these kind of things. The example I often give is, and this was 2 years ago, I had to renew a business, gross receipts tax number, had to reopen my gross receipts tax number. I had to drive down to an office where a very nice lady helped me, but all I did was tell her the information and she put it into the computer for me.
Why can't you just do it online, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
Okay.
And that's the sort of thing we can do that can help diversify the state. It's not a magic bullet. But it is something that would help quite a bit.
Okay. We have another question. Hello.
Yes. My name is Joe. I live in Las Cruces. I'm a transplant from Northeast U.S. Dr. Peach, this morning there was an interesting editorial in the Sun News about economics, in which the author said it's ridiculous to think of the deficit as being the difference between taxes that are taken in and what is spent out, because the United States can print all the money it wants. I didn't quite understand that. Do you have any idea what he was talking about?
Sure. Technically, the deficit is the difference between total government revenue, not just taxes, but total government revenue and total government expenditures. If you are talking about reducing the debt over time, I'll quote the famous Federal Reserve Chair, Alan Greenspan, a sovereign nation that prints its own currency cannot go bankrupt. And he's a guy who ranted and railed about the debt for half a century until it looked like the Clinton administration would eliminate it. And then he said, wait, time out, I need something to buy and sell to control interest rates. Money is not in short supply. We can create as much of it as we like.
Okay, so you're saying essentially in that letter there's some truth to this, but there are folks who are worried about interest rates going up, that could stall the national economy. What do you think about that? Is that a fair worry?
We have had in the last several years, especially 2010, 2011, 2012, the largest deficits on record and the lowest interest rates.
Yeah.
I can find no correlation between government spending, government deficits, and any sort of an interest rate. Not at the same time, not with some sort of lag. Just can't find it.
So, and I agree with what Jim has said, and I'll add something else too, that deficits in the United States are a second order issue. At some point, the debt could become large enough that people would lose confidence in the ability of the U.S. government to repay that debt. We are miles away from that. But in smaller economies, in state economies, for example, in Illinois, there it is possible that it can become an issue. And I would say the reason why the debt is a second order issue is because people think that it's being funded by borrowing. Well, no, it's not. It is being funded by borrowing in a technical sense, but in a very real sense, it's being funded by people who, instead of paying taxes, are voluntarily giving money to the government, thereby reducing their spending power, in the same way that someone who's paying taxes is giving money, not voluntarily, but at the point of the IRS, a spear, and it in a very large, or to a great extent, that's why deficits are not important. This is something that the reduction, what matters is not how you finance government spending, but how much government spending you have and whether that government spending is done efficiently.
Okay, and of course, as you both know, the big test on this could be coming in the decade ahead, because the Congressional Budget Office, when looking at the GOP tax plan, said the numbers don't add up, deficits are going to go up. So we'll have to see. The proponents of the tax plan say, no, we're going to have so much growth, we don't have to worry about it, we're not going to have to. So we'll have to see. We have another question from the audience.
Yeah, I'm Richard. I'm from Rio Rancho, and I have a question. You guys lightly touched base on it about NAFTA being depleted or something along those lines. So why fix something that's not broken? Would that leave us positive or less positive in the
I'm glad you brought this up, because of course this has a potentially very big effect on New Mexico. This is one of our real bright spots in our economy here, that we've had so much export business in Santa Teresa. It actually, for the first time, has exceeded the Albuquerque metro area for exports in our part of the state. Jim, I read something, and we'll get to you too, Chris, because I see you're nodding your head there. I saw in particular this week a story where the automotive industry is terribly worried about this, because of course we have a lot of car parts and cars assembled in Canada and Mexico.
Yes, and parts of them, not just the whole thing.
And parts of them too, sure.
The National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S.-Mexico, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, as well as the U.S.-Mexico Chamber of Commerce, have all pleaded with the current administration not to get rid of NAFTA. Now, are there things in NAFTA that could be renegotiated? Of course. The document is 25 years old. The Section 8, which is energy, looks antiquated. It was long before the shale revolution and the changes in energy in Mexico. It was a document written before any of us had cell phones. The telecommunications section needs to be rewritten. We never really solved the trucking issue of having trucks from all three countries go anywhere they wanted to. There are a number of issues that could be very, very beneficially redone. I don't know what this administration is going to do. The president keeps talking about dumping it all together, and clearly offended the president of Mexico last week in a phone conversation about the wall, so that the Mexican president is not coming to D.C. to visit.
Okay. Chris, thoughts on
Well, I was just going to say that one of the reasons why we've had long-term growth in Las Cruces that exceeds that, pardon me, in the state as a whole is because of the activity at the Santa Teresa Intermodal Train Depot. And that has been a major source of growth for our county. As you mentioned, that's led to an increase in exports and a lot of increase in activity. And the one other thing I would mention is that is that when you talk about automobile industry, remember Juarez is one of the centers in Mexico for automobile industry, and it will be adversely affected, and that will spill over into El Paso, and that will spill over into Las Cruces if we were to have a breakdown now.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. All right, we have another question.
Tyler from North Nebraska. We talked about unemployment rates and New Mexico as being higher than the average. We talked about many reasons for this, but what is the single leading factor to the reasoning of this?
We're not doing as well as our surrounding states, and I attribute a lot of that to workforce training, workforce preparation, including the educational system from early childhood through graduate school. We do some things pretty well here in New Mexico, but we don't play in the major leagues, as do our neighboring states. And if you were a firm looking for a place to locate, why not locate next door to the University of Texas or Texas A&M or the University of Colorado Boulder? They play in the big leagues. We don't.
So one thing also, I agree with what Jim just said, and it's not that exciting show when I agree with everything Jim says.
It's no good at all.
Yeah, but I would add also that if you look nationally, there is a strong trend towards growth in large urban areas. They've seen growth rates approximately 3 times the national average over the last 10 or 12 years. And then next is medium-sized urban areas, which include Albuquerque or places like that. And then the slowest growth in population and jobs has been in rural areas and in small towns, like Las Cruces. And of course, if you're talking about rural areas, that's much of New Mexico. And so we're seeing this national trend towards urbanization. We're much more urban today than we were 20 years ago, and it's becoming more intense as we move forward. And we see that when we talk about this creativity, need for creativity, and how urban areas tend to foster that creativity, that spillover to one creative enterprise, another creative enterprise. And that's part of what's explaining New Mexico's difficulty in keeping up the rest of the country.
Yeah, and of course our biggest metro area, Albuquerque, has had very serious problems with crime. Crime was cited in a study released just this week by 24/7 Wall Street as one of the reasons why New Mexico is struggling. We don't have a crime problem down here, but the state average is one of the highest in the country due to this enormous crime issue in the Albuquerque metro area. Do you think this does have an effect?
It can, for businesses that are looking for location.
But it's circular causation. A high unemployment rate contributes to crime, which contributes to the unemployment rate.
Makes it harder.
We also do not invest in the kind of infrastructure that we need in the state. We are the least wired state in the nation. We need broadband everywhere. We don't have it. We don't spend enough money on our state parks and rest areas to attract tourists. We have lots of infrastructure needs, and we're not funding.
Hence why that was in the story I did, which we saw. Infrastructure experts say that's important. Another question.
I'm Madeline from Las Cruces, and my question is, speaking of crime, with the crime rate growing in Juarez across the border, does that have a direct effect with the El Paso area and the Las Cruces area with the growth and development of the economy and unemployment?
It can. Of course, the crime is on the uptick in Juarez, and this is after a lull for several years. It's not back up to the levels it was, of course, 10 years ago, but it can cause a slowdown in growth in Juarez. And of course, there's a very strong linkage between Juarez and El Paso, between Juarez and Santa Teresa in New Mexico, and of course, El Paso and Las Cruces are also linked, and so it could have an effect. I think it's easy to overestimate that. I think that the very high violence that was there a decade ago did negatively impact the ability of Juarez to attract businesses and did negatively impact El Paso and Las Cruces to some small extent. But we're not at that same level of crime that we had back then yet. Well, keep your fingers crossed it doesn't happen.
And by all of the national crime statistics, the murder rate, the burglary rate, the robbery rate, El Paso is one of the safest cities in America.
Yeah, and was during the height of the crime.
Was during the height.
Yeah.
So it's a complicated relationship there.
Yep.
A very complicated relationship.
You know, speaking of complicated relationships, as we wait for our next audience question, I wonder if either of you would like to comment about the fact, whether or not you think that the great political uncertainty at the national level that we're going through in this country would have some effect, short-term or long-term, on our economy. Certainly our image around the world in terms of our global impact is, a lot of studies are showing that's being damaged. But in this country, a lot of people are worried too. Jim, I'll start with you.
Certainly, especially internationally. Mm-hmm. If the administration does what it campaigned on, of building a wall between the U.S. and Mexico, of leaving NAFTA, of instituting bilateral instead of multilateral trade deals, it could seriously disrupt international trade, and as we've already discussed, we're interlinked. More important than that, I think, is that the policies that are being followed contribute to a trend that's been going on for 40 years of increasing the degree of income inequality in this country, and that is, to me, the major threat to the U.S. economy. If we keep pushing income and wealth is a stock, very different, towards the upper end of the distribution, this is a consumer economy. Somebody working at a convenience store can't go out and buy a new car. You can't do that on $8.50 an hour.
It's about 70% of the economy, right?
Yes,
yeah, okay.
Consumption
the
is.
Consumer
And,
expense. Okay.
no, I think we're on the absolutely wrong policy path.
Okay, Chris?
Well, I don't disagree with Jim on those points. I will point out that whatever you think of Donald Trump as an individual, and I have a very low opinion of him as an individual, I will admit, he has implemented policies that are pro-business and that will lead, I think, to increased economic growth. Now, that economic growth may well be stifled by the Federal Reserve increasing interest rates, but left to their own devices, that they'll be effective. Now, one of the things that I think has not gotten a lot of play, but is one of the best things that Donald Trump has done, is his efforts to reduce the amount of regulation at the federal level. And it doesn't apply to every agency, but to the agencies to which it applies, they're requiring them to reduce, to eliminate, the quote is 2 pages of regulation for every page of new regulation. That actually is a very good policy. It's been implemented in many countries in the world: England, Netherlands, Australia. Almost every English-speaking country in the world has done this, and many other countries also. And
but the devil's in the details.
The devil's in the details.
We got to be clear on that.
Yeah, but the goal is, though, is that the experts who administer the rules know which rules are redundant and which rules are not cost effective.
Right. Yeah.
And this forces them to take the time to actually get rid of those, and as they put in new rules that are more effective.
Okay.
And you get away from this layering of one rule on top of another. That's an example of the kind of policies that I think that can be very helpful and that Donald Trump has implemented. But don't get me started about a lot of other things don't get me started about
We don't even
Russians.
have the full hour now. We just got about 10 minutes. So we have another question.
Yes, I'm Marvin from Las Cruces, and I'd like to ask this question about the minimum wage ordinance. I saw it, reading it, it said that they would review prior to each increase. So my assumption is the final increase to 1010 will be in before 2019. So my question to you as economists is what should they be reviewing, and would they tell us what they're reviewing so I know, what would you review to decide whether it's negative or positive effects of this minimum wage increase?
Great audience questions today, and this is one that I'm not surprised came up. And in fact, the final increase in the city minimum wage, the Las Cruces minimum wage law, is scheduled to take effect next January, and it is $10.10 an hour. But this summer, the City Council is scheduled to do a review on this. And there has been a study that is being commissioned, but he raises a good question. What is it that you exactly study? And I've heard a lot of economists say this is extremely difficult because there are so many factors that affect the economy to pin down and say the minimum wage is good or the minimum wage is bad is very hard. And it's fascinating in Las Cruces this question's coming up because, of course, right now we see a whole bunch of new employment here in minimum wage or near minimum wage jobs. Everything from fast food restaurants to grocery stores going in. So it hasn't deterred them from moving to Las Cruces. Major chains like Sprouts and Raising Cane's and Chipotle restaurant. Let's start with you on this, Chris.
Well, studies show, and there have been many, many studies of minimum wage, that taken as a whole, some find that minimum wage has an impact on employment, some find it has a positive impact because it increases purchasing power, some find it has a negative impact because it increases the cost of labor. But if you take them as a whole, add them all up, you find out that the net effect of minimum wage is pretty darn close to zero on employment. And so that old chestnut that minimum wage stifles job growth does not seem to be supported by the data. There are impacts, though. Small businesses that have low-wage workers, and there's a lot of small businesses in Las Cruces with low-wage workers, are more negatively impacted because they don't have the profitability and the reserves to pay higher wages compared to the national chains.
And that gets to the nut of his question, really, in the sense that you can have individual effects, but that's not the same as an overall effect or an economic effect. And we have the added thing now that we have a lot of employers on their own that have already gone beyond $10.10 an hour. Yes. Walmart, $11 an hour. Target's talking about $15 an hour by 2020. CVS, $11 an hour. So major national employers that have already gone to $11 an hour. Jim, you know, when I hear people talk about this, it isn't part of this, you know, and you look at the national picture, isn't part of this really just, and it's tough, it's a tough thing if you're at the wrong end of it, but it's capitalism that businesses that do well, that can really do well, can pay higher wages, that they have a good market. But if you're not doing as well, you might not be able to pay as much and keep your profit margin the same.
Yeah, and historically, the Fair Labor Standards Act nationally was passed in 1937, and it set a minimum wage of 10 cents an hour and overtime at 15 cents an hour. And there were people who thought that that would be the end of the U.S. economy. It was just a horrible thing. And in the intervening 70 years, 80 years now, we've done pretty well. This country was not built on cheap labor. It was not. Especially in the 19th century, we had a shortage of labor, and that brought forth a lot of capital investment, more machines per worker. And that was a really good thing for productivity. This country was built on rising real wages. And we need to keep that up. The minimum wage lags at the federal level, lags way behind what it was in the 60s.
Well, that's another great point. That you know, $7.25 an hour is nowhere near close to where the minimum wage would be if it had been raised with inflation. It would be. And it changes, of course, all the time, but it would be in this $10 to $11 an hour range.
Locally, If you expected an effect, it would be a relocation of businesses, or new businesses that came would locate outside the city limits. And we don't really have the data to examine that.
Okay. So again, that raises the other question. You can do a study, but it doesn't necessarily tell you an answer if you don't study the right thing.
I feel sorry for whoever gets the contract to study it here in Las Cruces. I've refused to even consider that for several years now.
Okay, well, we'll be looking into it this summer. Another question.
My name is Tanner, here from Las Cruces. I was going to change the subject and wanted to ask a question regarding the current situation in the stock market. There's a lot of volatility going on right now, and basically being accredited, to the interest rates raising from the Fed. Do you believe there will be more than one interest rate hike, and if so, do you think it will have an impact on the state economy?
So I think there will be more than one interest rate hike. I think that the consensus is for 3.25% each, and I think that's a good guess. It might be 4, it might be 2. I doubt it'd be 1, and I doubt it'll be 5. And of course, when interest rates rise, it can have a negative impact on employment. On employment and the economy, because higher interest rates reduces business profitability, and that can lead to layoffs. However, in the current environment, the problem is not interest rates. The problem is profitable projects. We are awash in liquidity in this country. We have, before the Great Recession, the excess reserves, which are funds that are available to banks to lend, ran $1 billion or $2 billion on average, and currently they're running $1 trillion or $2 trillion on average. That's 1,000 times higher than they were before the Great Recession. And banks have plenty of funds to lend. A rise in interest rates is not going to be a big deal for the state economy, because the big deal is having businesses who qualify for credit that is available.
Yeah.
It's the credit rating, not the credit rate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even if we had, as Mr. Powell suggested yesterday, 4 interest rate increases this year at a quarter point each, that gets us to 2.4%. Yeah. Wouldn't that be terrible? That's about half of the long-term federal funds rate.
So it's historically low.
Historically low, even if we have 4 increases. In regard to the stock market, between January of last year and January of this year, the Dow increased by 27%. The gross domestic product increased by 2.5%. The Dow increased 10 times as fast as GDP. 27% is a lot. It's a lot. Don't expect that to go on forever. Will we have a crash? Of course we will have a correction or a bear market at some point. When? Who knows?
Yeah.
Hyman Minsky, one of the great economists of the 20th century, once said that stability is destabilizing. That when the economy is growing nice and smooth and everybody expects it to continue to do that, we start taking risks that we shouldn't take, and we'll have a bubble on something, and it'll create financial instability, and that'll create a problem in the real economy. But we have not eliminated the business cycle. We're going to have another downturn at some point. Nobody knows when.
They just naturally happen.
No, they're not natural.
Okay. They routinely happen.
Yes.
Okay. So, Chris, in our final few minutes here, we're going to have next year a new governor. And we hear a lot from the candidates running for governor right now about their economic plans, because no surprise, people are very concerned. They want someone elected governor who has some ideas on ways to boost the economy. We've covered some ground on this. Anything you have not had a chance to talk about that this next chief executive of the state needs to be aware of and do?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We have covered some ground, and you know, I sometimes I feel like a broken record. I always talk K-12 education. I talk about pre-K education. I'm supportive of opening up the permanent funds to finance that. I'm supportive of raising taxes to finance that. It is pre-K education, high quality pre-K education. You got to be careful. You got to say it has to be high quality. It's not just babysitting. But high quality pre-K education has one of the highest returns of any social program that we know of. And as a state, as a country, as a state, it's a no-brainer to fund it. But funding good, high-quality pre-K education means funding it at the same level you'd fund a high school class or even a college class. It's not cheap, and so finding some way to pay for that should be a high priority. Post-pre-K, that is K-12 education, is also very important. We haven't mentioned the role of universities. Jim alluded to it a little bit. But universities are very important for economic development, and what they do is they serve as a means of training high-quality, employees, but they also serve as a place that industry can go to for help with problems when they face problems. And in New Mexico, we're facing a brain drain where we're not funding our university at an adequate level, and we're not able to attract or retain high-quality people.
Okay, Jim, I got about 30 seconds. You get the final word.
Go. You know, we haven't been doing very well in New Mexico for a very long time because at the state level, people in both parties view economic development as opening up the data center outside of Berlin.
Facebook, which was a minimal number of jobs, really.
50, 100, whatever it is. Very short-term things. Economic development is a long-term game that requires the long-term investments that Chris was talking about and that I can talk about all day long.
And you said earlier, broadband, expansion, roads and bridges, education, anything else?
You bet. You know, one of the suggestions I've pushed for years is to have every high school graduate in New Mexico be genuinely bilingual.
What an amazing opportunity.
And we live in this international economy. What bragging rights that would give us. Bring your firm here and you've got a bilingual workforce. And I don't care if it's Spanish. It could be Chinese, Arabic, French. And by the way, language teachers compared to physics teachers are pretty cheap. We could do that. There are a whole list of things we could do. You told me I've only got 30 seconds.
You've already went past it, but we leave a little leeway. We know better, right?
Right.
Dr. Jim Peach, Dr. Chris Erickson, thank you both for being here. Thank you at home, and thank you for being part of the reason this community has in-depth local journalism. It's because of your support. You can become a member or renew your membership anytime at krwg.org. Hope you have a great week.